So I'd like to welcome everybody this morning to our second day of TENOR Boston 2023. I hope you enjoyed yesterday's program. The concerts last night I think were spectacular, and I see some composers from concerts today, concerts last night. So just a quick round for those who participated last night. Most excited now to present our keynote speaker this morning, Holly Watkins, who is a fellow Berkeleyan. We have a bond through Professor Richard Turuskin, as well as the University of California, Berkeley. But she joins us today as a professor from the Eastman School of Music to speak on her topic related to her book, Musical Vitalities, Ventures in Biotic Aesthetics of Music. I don't have with me the exact title of her talk here because I'm on the wrong page.
It's right there on the screen so they can see it.
And in fact, with an excellent suggestion, Conception and Perception, Structure and Form, Thoughts on the Representation of Animal Song. Please, a round of applause.
Thank you, and thanks, Tony, for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here. What better way to begin a paper on the representation of animal song than with a video posted on Instagram? I might play this twice because it's just so awesome. Okay, you get the idea. All right. Twice? Twice. Maybe at the end. We'll come back to it. All right. Now, I'm aware there's a lot of fake stuff on the internet, but what's going on here strikes me as not implausible. The minute-long clip shows a cockatiel playing hide-and-seek with an off-screen human. The cockatiel moves up and down and side to side behind a can of LaCroix sparkling water while squawking, trilling, clicking, and eventually uttering the phrase peekaboo, an imitation of human words, which the human then imitates. How might one go about representing animal song in this video? Let's try two different approaches, both of them informal and descriptive. Whoops, okay. First, what I'm calling a human exceptionalist representation makes a number of distinctions between bird and human, between the bird squawks and trills and its imitations of human sounds, indicated in single or double quotes, and between the human's language and her other vocal sounds, in this case, laughter. I've chosen not to notate the Instagram background music. Now, let's try an ornithomorphic representation, borrowing a term from biologists W. Tecumseh Fitch and Eric D. Jarvis. In this representation, the only thing that matters is the distinction between innate calls and learned vocalizations, and even that distinction is not absolute. Innate calls, which can indicate anything from alarm to the presence of food to distinct affective states, do not have to be learned from one's elders, and they can be modified in response to contextual factors, such as ambient sonic conditions or the utterances of other individuals. In addition to innate calls, some animals produce vocalizations based on what they've learned from members of their own or other species, a skill known as complex vocal learning. Cockatiels and other members of the parrot order, along with hummingbirds and oscine songbirds, are vocal learners, as are humans and a few other mammals, such as dolphins, whales, and elephants. Complex vocal learning evolved separately in these various lineages in a process called convergent evolution, meaning the independent development of similar features and cognitive abilities. Other notable examples include eyes, which emerged separately in vertebrates, cephalopods, and jellyfish, and the capacity for flight in birds and bats. In birds, complex vocal learning encompasses both imitated and newly invented songs. Some birds learn by stages to duplicate the songs of adult members of their species, which then stay relatively fixed. Other birds' repertories remain open-ended into adulthood, with adults continuing to assimilate or create novel song elements. Granting priority to broad evolutionary outcomes or similarities over human self-regard, Fitch and Jarvis use the term ornithomorphic to cut across customary distinctions between speech and song. While they acknowledge the importance of what they call combinatorial propositional semantics in differentiating language and music, they emphasize that both these human arts, quote, take the vocal output mechanism as their default in all cultures, end quote, and that, quote, song and speech share a core similarity, reliance on vocal learning, end quote. In birds, the same neural pathways support the creation of song and the imitation of human speech. Transferring this bird's eye view to human vocality, Fitch and Jarvis group language and music together as learned vocalizations, even though the precise neural relationship between the two remains unclear, despite some overlap in areas of the brain involved. In this way, they draw attention to what humans share with other vocal learners rather than what sets them apart. My ornithomorphic representation of the Instagram video, then, shows both animals engaging in a mixture of innate and learned vocalizations. And not being a cockatiel expert, I'm not sure which of the utterances are truly innate, which are innate but modified through what's called production learning, and which have been learned from humans. The graph shows the second animal making innate sounds indicating amusement, i.e. laughter, in response to the movements and vocalizations of the first animal. Halfway through the video, the animals start exchanging sounds that mimic each other in what ethologists might call a duet. While the calls of animal 2 attest to affective states of amusement and desire for interaction, what is peekaboo other than an invitation to interact, the states indicated by the calls of animal 1 are not subject to direct confirmation. At the very least, animal 1 also displays a desire for interaction and an intrinsic need to communicate. I begin with this video not just because it's 9 in the morning and I got up at 4 to get here, but because it leads straight into a nexus of issues surrounding the comparative study of human and animal sound making. Whatever its limitations within a traditional humanistic context, Fitch and Jarvis's outlook encourages us to seek the common ground between the vocalizations of distantly related species based on the confluence of affective arousal, communicative intent, and the power to actively shape vocal utterance. At the same time, as my two graphs make clear, despite their crudeness, our attempts to represent these vocalizations necessarily leave out a huge amount of information about the overall scene, the cues to which animals are responding, and the affects they experience in producing and listening to sounds. My paper this morning explores implications of this selectivity in the case of a trio of techniques historically used to represent birdsong: human language, human music, and spectrograms. As the latter technique continues to reach new heights of sophistication, it begins to shape our experience of birdsong in particular ways. My concern today is with how we go about putting what is gained through our representations of birdsong back into the larger context of the multi-species communities comprising our earthly ecosystems. Humans have been notating birdsongs for hundreds of years. If you've ever browsed a guide to birds, you've probably seen the sequences of words or syllables birders use to describe various calls, such as drink your tea for the towhee, who cooks for you for the barred owl, and fee bee for the chickadee. This kind of notation functions more as a mnemonic device than as an accurate representation. In his 1907 book, Sketch of a New Aesthetic of Music, composer Ferruccio Busoni wrote, quote, "Notation, the writing out of compositions, is primarily an ingenious expedient for catching an inspiration with the purpose of exploiting it later," end quote. Busoni's point applies to the inspirations of birdsong, notations of which the attentive naturalist hopes to exploit in the field at some later point. Attempts to transcribe the songs of birds into musical notation go back at least to Athanasius Kircher's Musorgia Universalis of 1650, and this technique continued to be used well into the 20th century by ornithologists and composers alike. From the cuckoo and nightingale in Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, to the hermit thrushes of Amy Beach's piano music, to numerous works by Olivier Messiaen, the musical notation of birdsong has proven an enduring way to not only capture the sounds of birds in written form, but also pay homage to birds from within the sphere of human music. Linguistic and musical notations of birdsong both rely on the cognitive resource of analogy, on the ability and willingness to hear birdsong as enough like human speech or music that the techniques for representing the latter seem suitable for the former. To the analogical mind, when birds are singing, it sounds like something is being said, or a melody is being sung. In this way, we interpret birdsong as fundamentally communicative, and we may even feel a sense of kinship with creatures profoundly different from us. Interestingly, applications of linguistic and musical notation to birdsong reinforce Fitch and Jarvis's ornithomorphic view of language and music as closely related products of complex vocal learning. In other words, we can imitate birds using either a kind of syllabic speech song or just musical tones. And certain birds, such as the cockatiel, can imitate both in return. Notation here is not an endpoint, but a way station, a momentary stopping point along a spiral of encounters, of excursions into the field and back. For all their usefulness, however, written notations of birdsong have their limitations. Words, syllables, and musical notes inevitably force the sounds birds make into representational systems that weren't designed for them. And the resulting translations lend a misleading regularity to more loosely organized pitches and rhythms. Even worse, neither linguistic nor musical notation tells us much about the timbre of different calls. Finally, many birds are simply too fast for us to notate in any conventional manner. How, for example, would one go about notating the songs of this fellow? So think about trying to write that down.
Fairly repetitive, though.
Okay. By the early 20th century, ornithologists were devising alternative methods of notation, plotted lines, dots, curves on graph paper, while recording technology allowed them to record calls for later study. But what really catapulted the study of birdsong to new heights was a mode of representation that departed from the auditory realm altogether, the spectrogram. Spectrograms, or sonograms, were initially produced using the sound spectrograph, a technology that creates real-time images of the full range of frequencies and amplitudes comprising a sound. Based on technology developed in the 1940s to help identify enemy warships and other threats at sea, the sound spectrograph was harnessed in the 1950s by ornithologists seeking new sources of information about birdsong. And here there's just an image from a very well-known book on birdsong showing these three different types of representation we've been talking about. And I'll talk about that book more in a minute. In the decades since, spectrograms have allowed ornithologists to see the remarkable complexity of birdsong, or at least those aspects of it that can be parceled out into frequencies, amplitudes, and time points. This video of a song thrush spectrogram will give you a good idea of what this technology looks like if you don't already know. So you all probably already know this, but the brighter parts indicate greater amplitude. I hope that doesn't start playing something. Hold on. Okay, let's just make sure.
Can't go?
No. That's the best thing that's ever happened during a paper. Okay. Oh, God. All right. Some of you may also know that on the Merlin app created by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, you can make audio and spectrographic recordings of the birdsong soundscapes around you as the app tries to identify birds in your area. So as you're recording, this spectrogram goes by and it pops up birds that it thinks it's hearing. It's pretty cool. Spectrograms in hand, ornithologists have learned that the winter wren can sing up to 36 pitches per second, and that numerous birds, including canaries and mockingbirds, can produce multiphonics by independently activating the two sides of the syrinx, the avian vocal production organ. The two sides of the syrinx are also generally used by birds to cover different parts of their song's frequency ranges, with transitions between them taking place seamlessly. Among the most fascinating outcomes of spectrographic analysis is the discovery that Western hierarchies of musical structure do not necessarily pertain to the perceptions of birds. Researchers have tended to assume that pitch is of primary importance in birds' abilities to distinguish each other's calls. Yet recent experiments in avian melodic recognition have suggested that birds, although they do perceive pitch and may adjust their calls to the pitches of nearby conspecifics, as chickadees do not, as far as we can tell, rely on simple differences in pitch or timbre to identify melodic patterns. As research psychologist Anirudh Patel points out, while European starlings easily recognize transposed conspecific songs, they do not recognize transpositions of pitch sequences composed of pure sine tones. This is not terribly surprising in retrospect, since birds never hear sine tones in the wild, making them a poor choice of experimental stimuli. Instead, the most decisive cue for recognition starling researchers have identified is the spectral shape of a melody, or its pattern of energy across frequency bands. What is more, Patel reports, the absolute spectral envelope, or the overall pattern of spectral amplitudes across particular frequency bands, may be of greatest interest to the birds. The upshot seems to be that starlings, and likely birds in general, glean an incredible amount of fine-grained sonic information from each other's calls. At least when it comes to songs related to mating and territory, the musical art of birds seems to be based on projecting and receiving as much identifying information as possible in each vocal act. Every such song is part of an ongoing song contest. Alarm calls, by contrast, may either reveal or suppress identity. Ethologist Peter Marler, co-author of the comprehensive textbook on birdsong entitled Nature's Music, notes that some alarm calls place, quote, a high premium on individual and species identity, but others are anonymous, sometimes so similar across species that they provide a common code that enables birds to move and feed as one multi-species flock, end quote. In comparison, human music usually chooses to mask identity through polyphony or choral singing, which prioritizes pitch matching over timbral uniqueness and relies on our species' capacity for rhythmic entrainment. This is all to say that while spectrograms have shown us many features of birdsong we wouldn't otherwise be able to detect, understanding how birds actually use their calls and respond to those of others demands an acute sensitivity to context. While the spectrograph resembles technologies like telescopes and ultraviolet light detectors in supplementing the capacities of human perception, such technologies are not neutral. They change the nature of the thing observed. Fed into a spectrograph, birdsong becomes a mere signal like any other, a sound stripped of context and open only to particular kinds of analysis, namely those enabled by the technology at hand and the mode of representation it favors. The website earbirding.com, a spin-off of the authoritative Peterson's Field Guide to Bird Sounds, highlights this very issue by offering guidance on how to visualize sounds. And then here's the table of contents for this. Beyond gross features of pitch change and rhythmic profile, however, it proves extremely difficult to imagine the actual sound of a song or call by looking at a spectrogram, as even experts such as Russ Sharif of the Cornell Lab have admitted. The alien appearance of spectrograms and the difficulty of reconstructing the sounds they represent by ear has led ornithologists to devise a form of notation just for them. These spectrogram symbols are linear shapes indicating stable pitch or glissando-like shifts between pitches, shapes that, as the earbirding website explains, bring into focus basic patterns and similarities among different calls. By removing precisely what was unique about the spectrogram, its revelation of auditory details we cannot effectively describe otherwise, spectrogram symbols revert to an informal sort of musical notation, if one that, like early chant notation, shows only pitch stasis or change instead of exact pitches. It would appear that, in order to be maximally useful, the precision of spectrographic representation must revert to the approximate nature of notation. Furthermore, these are the other symbols. Since spectrogram symbols are essentially visual notations of visual representations of auditory or better ecological phenomena, the danger of reductionism has only multiplied. All bird sounds, the earbirding site attests, can be described with just 5 basic pitch patterns or combinations thereof. What is left, one wonders, of the full-bodied or full-throated experience of birdsong in the wild as the communicative expression of living individuals occupying a particular place and time? At this point, it might be useful to revisit the theme of this conference by asking, somewhat perversely, whether the structure of a sound is first and foremost something we perceive, or is it something we arrive at through the secondary process of analysis? The Oxford English Dictionary strongly suggests the latter by defining structure as the arrangement of and relations between the parts or elements of something complex. So the outcome of analysis, of breaking down into parts. In the case of music, we can and do advance interpretations of structure that have little to do with what anyone perceives, though we also know that learning about what we call musical structure can subsequently influence our perception. In the case of spectrograms, before the parts of a signal can even come under consideration, they have to be displayed through the electronically mediated translation of sonic signals into visual images. The structures spectrograms depict are not so much revealed to perception as they are enabled by technologically assisted analysis. I have already noted that it can be difficult to integrate the insights of spectrograms into the real-time perception of birdsong. What, then, do listeners perceive in birdsong, if not its structure, in the sense I'm suggesting here? Even if they cannot precisely describe the mixture of frequencies or number of syllables belonging to a particular call, humans can still distinguish, with practice, between the different timbres, melodic shapes, and rhythmic patterns that give a species of bird its unique voice. Without insisting on an absolute distinction between the two, I'd like to propose form as the complement to structure, or more strongly, as both the precondition of structure and the goal to which it should lead. The OED defines form as shape or configuration, the way in which a thing appears, a manifestation. Crucially, this definition situates form somewhere between source and perceiver, as both the manifestation of something outside us and the way something appears to us. Form hovers between our perceptual capacities and the things of this world. Alternatively, one might say that form belongs to the realm of perception itself, which the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer defined as empirical encounters between concrete things, sensations, and the unconscious mediation of concepts. Structure, although we like to consider it an objective property of things, belongs more to the realm of abstract thought, because it is the product of conscious mediation by concepts. As a composer often associated with the elevation of form over structure put it, In every case where human understanding tries to abstract from divine works the laws according to which they are constructed, it turns out that we find only laws which characterize our cognition through thinking and our power of imagination. We always see and recognize only ourselves. Arnold Schoenberg wrote these words in an essay on Gustav Mahler, and their cautionary force has by no means lessened over the years. In contrast to structure, form leads seamlessly to affect, traditionally through the experience of beauty. Those of you familiar with the history of aesthetics will recall that Immanuel Kant located the sense of beauty in the observer rather than the object, even as he remained attentive to aspects of form that seemed to support ascriptions of beauty. Indeed, the history of aesthetics flourishes just where form shades into affective response. After all, we take pleasure in beauty, even if this pleasure is considered to be indirect or disinterested. This is only to say that admiring the beauty of an apple creates a different sort of pleasure than eating it. Although humans have long appreciated the beauty of birdsong, the legacy of human exceptionalism has denied that experience to birds themselves, on the assumption that their songs are merely functional. But it turns out that we don't even know what we mean by such a judgment. As the Peterson Guide notes, quote, "Little is known about the function of many bird sounds. One sound frequently serves several different functions, and different sounds can serve the same function," end quote. Moreover, ornithologist Richard Prum has questioned the widespread assumption that the splashy visual and auditory displays of male birds primarily convey reproductive fitness to female birds. In his book, The Evolution of Beauty, Prum grants females the prerogative to choose a mate on aesthetic grounds alone, and he thereby makes room for the irrationality of desire in the broader outcomes of evolution. Taking the male perspective, Mahler explicitly links birdsong's exuberant formal play to affective arousal. Although the vocalizations of birds may fulfill generally functional roles, the details of their execution and, as Prum argues, their appreciation by others, go beyond what the concept of function can accommodate. Mahler calls songs related to mating and territory primarily non-symbolic and affective, words that evoke the parallel realm of human music. Indeed, his description of the male winter wren's invented songs stirs thoughts of music's recurring melodic and rhythmic motifs. Each song in the repertoire contains phrases drawn from a large pool that recur again and again, but in each song type they are arranged in a different sequence. Evidently, what happens when a young male learns to sing is that he acquires a set of songs from the adults he hears and breaks them down into phrases or segments. He then creates variety and enlarges his repertoire by rearranging these phrases or segments in different patterns. Similarly, neuroscientist Bjorn Merker explains that when birds invent songs, either, quote, the sequencing of a set of song elements is varied on a non-deterministic basis, end quote, or, quote, model patterns are disassembled into phrases and fragments and reassembled into new, unique song types, end quote. This variation and recombination of learned elements, which Mahler terms phonocoding, generates what he calls sensory diversity, rather than the proliferation of meanings characteristic of lexicoded systems such as human language. The larger point is that the technique of phonocoding allows birdsong to exceed quite spectacularly the economic constraints usually associated with function and to cross over into the realm of art. Like the peacock's tail, some birdsongs are inventive to excess. The brown thrasher, for example, is thought to be the most prolific creator of songs in North America, capable of maintaining over 1,000 different song elements in its repertory. Locating the origin of art in animality, feminist philosopher Elizabeth Gross contends that art is, quote, the sexualization of survival, or equally, sexuality is the rendering artistic, the exploration of the excessiveness of nature, end quote. For Gross, the human arts both derive from and feed the body's erotic energies, And in this respect, they resemble performances in the animal world that go beyond sheer necessity by carrying out complex protocols of sexual display and territorial defense. Such performances also constitute modes of avian self-realization. In one of the bolder passages of his work, Marlar encourages us to hear the repertories of phonocodeing birds as, quote, providing aesthetic enjoyment, or as alleviating boredom in singer and listener, end quote. Given subsequent research showing that singing releases endorphins and opioids in the brains of birds, perhaps the philosopher G.W.F. Hegel was not entirely wrong to suggest that birds sing for, quote, the immediate enjoyment of self, end quote. In another miracle of convergent evolution, birds also sing for the immediate enjoyment of their human listeners. Even as Gross acknowledges that, quote, there is no direct line of development between birdsong and human music, end quote, she contends that both kinds of song represent, quote, the opening up of the world itself to the force of taste, appeal, the bodily, pleasure, desire, end quote. Not only have the pressures of survival motivated the independent development in different animal populations of vision and communication via complex vocal learning, these developments have also allowed creatures to see and hear each other, to regard and appraise one another. While such abilities no doubt reflect the ongoing evolutionary arms race between predators and prey, they have also spawned more varied modes of interaction, ranging from indifference, as between animals who are neither predator nor prey to one another, to mutual interest, as when humans and dogs regard one another, to mutual mimicry, as between humans and birds. For humans, at least, the ability to imitate others appears to be closely related to the ability to enter into others' life worlds through empathy and imagination. As philosopher Kathleen Marie Higgins argues in her book, The Music Between Us, just as we recognize the life and energy of other human beings when we listen to music, we recognize kindred life and energy of birds and other creatures through the sounds they produce. The delight we take in birdsong, for example, is continuous with our pleasure in human music, for it is similarly grounded in a recognition that we are part of the same living world, end quote. Higgins' views have a long philosophical history. In an essay published in 1800, Johann Gottfried Herder wrote that, quote, everything that sounds in nature is music, end quote, and that humans are able to, quote, lend their sympathy to every aroused being whose voice reaches them, end quote. According to Herder, humans are able to generalize the emotional responsiveness to sound that he thought circulated primarily among members of a given species. Yet this was possible because the voice, as the animal's primary organ of expression and appeal, arouses the sympathies of others in immediate fashion. In the well-known essay on the origin of language from 1770, Herder argued, even the most delicate chords of animal feeling are aligned in their entire performance for going out toward other creatures. The plucked chord performs its natural duty. It sounds. It calls for an echo from one that feels alike, even if none is there, even if it does not hope or expect that such another might answer, end quote. Animal sounds, in other words, are made for other animals, some of whom belong to the species while others do not. 2 centuries later, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari asked in their book, 1,000 Plateaus, what is a cry, independent of the population it appeals to or takes as its witness? Here at Northeastern, Rebecca Kleinberger's remarkable work on inter- and intra-species communication among birds confirms that vocality comprises a fundamental means of connection, both within and across species. The importance of affect and sympathetic communication in the animal world alerts us to the parallel importance of ethical research design in our dealings with animals. It would be one thing if only humans had been expelled from the garden on account of our thirst for knowledge, but unfortunately, we've taken our non-human research subjects with us. I'm encouraged in this regard by the work of institutions such as the Farm Sanctuary in Watkins Glen, New York, no relation to me, which studies the emotional lives of farm animals, but allows them to choose whether or not to participate in research activities. Their work was written up in the New York Times a while back. Similarly, other scientists and thinkers are working to remind us that the knowledge science makes available is not the only kind, nor even the most valuable. This is becoming increasingly apparent as the scientific, industrial, capitalist complex bequeathed to modernity by the West confronts not only its deleterious ecological consequences, but also human ways of engaging with the world that colonization and social homogenization have tried to stamp out. In her 2013 book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants, the Potawatomi biologist Robin Wall Kimmerer takes a hybrid approach, blending her training in the botanical sciences with the plant lore of indigenous peoples. Gesturing toward non-scientific ways of knowing, Kimmerer describes an episode of intentional listening while seated in a pine forest. I come here to listen, to turn off the voice in my head until I can hear the voices outside it, the shh of wind and needles, water trickling over rock, nuthatch tapping, chipmunks digging, and something more, something that is not me, for which we have no language, the wordless being of others in which we are never alone, end quote. Such impressions, Kimmerer admits, cannot be represented by the scientific names she knows so well, names that typically arise from acts of seeing rather than hearing or feeling. From science's language of objects, she writes, quote, something is missing, the same something that swells around you and in you when you listen to the world, end quote. This something is akin to a sense of belonging, of co-presence, of being in relationship with the living world that permeates and sustains us. Needless to say, this is something no spectrogram can represent, though language can allude to it, and music can convey similar affective states. By extracting signals from the world and breaking them down into parts we find useful, even if only for the purposes of knowledge, spectrograms resemble other practices of resource extraction that sociologist Hartmut Rosa classes among modernity's mute relationships to the world. What Kimmerer describes, and what I'm inclined to grant higher priority, are the resonant relationships that, for Rosa, modern life routinely promises but so often fails to deliver. With these reflections in mind, it becomes clear that revelations of signal structure cannot be the end point of our engagement with birdsong, or indeed with any animal sound. Analysis, I propose, must be succeeded by synthesis, the conception of structure by the perception of form. I'm currently navigating this problem in my use of the Merlin app. Over the past few days, I've been hearing a bird in my area whose calls sound like the beginning of the refrain in the Christmas song Deck the Halls. Fa la 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 la. Merlin is convinced the bird is a song sparrow. I see plenty of them around, but the recorded songs of the species provided by the app do not quite match what I'm hearing. As any avid student of the natural world will tell you, the identification suggested by an app should mark the beginning, not the end of a journey, in which we not only seek knowledge, but open ourselves to the place and time-specific something more to which Kimmerer alludes. My next task is to try to spot the bird in the act of singing with binoculars, no small feat given the camouflaged appearance of most sparrows, which in their very difference from the more noticeable orioles and goldfinches flitting around my backyard, provides yet another opportunity to ponder the multiple, not fully knowable factors driving the divergent outcomes of evolution, whether the long-term effects of individual mate choice, the demands of particular breeding locales, genetic mutations, or a host of other possibilities. If the bird calling fa la 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 is a song sparrow, then I have occasion to marvel at the beauty of the call as well as the cultural variation that is possible among the calls of different regional populations. Moving from analysis to synthesis, whether through experiences in the wild or practices in the lab, we cultivate awareness of, sensitivity to, and appreciation of our presence in and among other sounding, acting, and feeling creatures. Since I've already mentioned Hegel, and I just thought flamingos and Hegel, why not? I might as well close in the spirit of the phenomenology of spirit by seconding the philosopher's call for the sublation of scientific knowledge. In my updated version of the preserving while overcoming indicated by this word, science would give way not to Hegel's systematic philosophy, but to an ethics of mutual flourishing and obligation to animal others. Such an ethics would take its place within a comprehensive ecological perspective in which humans assume full membership in and responsibility toward the natural world, rather than clinging to the belief that they somehow stand apart from or even above it. I realize this sounds impossibly utopian, but who knows? Maybe a cockatiel calling peekaboo will someday inspire us to show a different face to the world. Thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. We have some fair amount of time for questions. Questions? Yes, Dr. Koidu.
I'm not jumping out of my seat now.
Okay.
I realized, okay, but anyway, I found this presentation absolutely intriguing, and I was wondering about the amount of neurological studies that were made with birds. The ethical questions aside, I was wondering how much research has been done on brain regions and whether there's a distinction between communicative calls and calls for sheer or mere pleasure. As you know, we can somehow differentiate in the human brain.
Yeah.
And then also, I once read an extremely interesting article about the parrot brain, and they said the parrot brain differs from other birds in certain ways that are analogous how the human brain differs from other animals or mammals' brains. So I was also wondering about distinctions between bird species.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, because I mean, not all birds are vocal learners. So some of them have these pathways that are similar then to human pathways, and some of them don't. So there's been a lot of work, I think, on, parrot brains and other complex vocal learning birds to show that. And I'll just put this up here because the Patel essay is a good overview, and it's recent, 2019, where he talks quite a lot about studies of birds' neurology and has some graphics of brains and comparative images showing kind of the different organization of avian brains compared to humans, and distinguishing between the pathways that make vocal learning possible, but then showing the analogies as well. As far as research distinguishing songs for pure pleasure versus communication, I don't think our knowledge goes that deep. I don't think we have any way to tell, especially because that's also going to be the more subjective experience of the bird, as if we were sort of looking. I'm not sure we could look in our brains and tell what the difference was between just a mere urge to communicate and getting some pleasure out of something.
I think we do, but I'm not the expert on that. Maybe Psychology can say a few words about that. Maybe.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm actually looking at this paper right now, Dopamine Neurons Encode Performance Error in Singing Birds. And I'm wondering, there are many advances to recording from different regions of the brain that include the endorphin system that you're talking about, also the dopaminergic systems, they're all doing different things, right?
Yeah.
Maybe some of them are more for communicative pressure, others are more for a sexual selection display, and others might be for alleviating boredom, as suggests. So I'm just wondering, if you had kind of blue sky ability to redesign a scientific program, this is blue sky question, right? Like, what would it take to accomplish this comprehensive ecological approach that you're advocating?
Yeah, I'm not sure it is a purely scientific program. That's the issue. And I have a lot, I get very tangled up in my mind about the ethics of doing this research and what is the price of our knowledge when we have to kill birds to study.
Well, do you think that, for example, like what our colleague Feinberger is doing is not ethical?
Well, I think she's doing more, I don't think she's dissecting birds.
Right, so if you had alive behaving birds that you could also simultaneously record dopamine from without dissecting them,
Yeah.
Would that be a step in the right direction?
A step in the right direction. Yeah, I think so. I think every step of the way needs to be questioned, right? The kind of interventions that we make with animals, the kind of devices we attach to them in order to record, the kinds of, invasive procedures that we're engaged in.
There's a spectrum of how invasive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I totally agree. And I'm as fascinated by this information as anyone. But I think it's very easy for us to just say, well, we want to know. Therefore, we should be able to do what we want in order to know. And I'm not comfortable with that. But yeah. I'm curious to hear from others because I just sit around thinking about this. So.
Take that even further then.
Yeah, yeah.
In terms of ethics, is the act of listening then a form of reductivism?
Well, I don't know if we can help listening, right? And listening has different purposes, right? Listening as sort of aware of what birds are in the neighborhood, what that means about migration patterns and bird populations. It's sort of more kind of ecological rather than strictly biological sorts of investigation seem to me different and more kind of all-encompassing and more operating at a distance in a sense. But it's all sort of a question. We're in everybody's way, so I'm not sure there's a line to be drawn. Like, these people are doing ethical work and these people aren't. I mean, we're here. We're ruining the planet. We're all doing whatever. But yeah, I don't want to get totally tangled up in that. But it's difficult because we do, what we know about other creatures can be really supportive of our desire to protect their ecosystems. But so can what we don't know about creatures. Yeah.
I think I just found a research question. I did some experiments with bird songs 20 years ago. I'm not an expert in bird songs, but I did some experiments. And we were very astonished when we heard that a blackbird, in the blackbird song, those sections which are only one rough sound for our ear, for our consciousness reception. There are notes and then there's some rough section. And this section is, when you slow it down, is indeed an arpeggio. A very beautiful arpeggio of thousands of very small notes which we cannot perceive because they are too fast.
Yeah.
So the question is, perhaps we perceive them, but we don't perceive them consciously.
Right.
Perhaps we really hear this arpeggio on a subconscious level, but not with our melody detecting brain.
Yeah.
So it could be a nice experiment to replace these things by white noise, and look at it as still the same effect on a human listener.
Yeah, that would be interesting, or especially an avian listener. And that's another question too. Do the birds hear every distinct sound in that, right? And if so, how?
Yeah.
Right. Also, fascinating question. Yeah.
I'm curious what prompted you to write this. What?
This invitation?
That was it?
Well, I mean,
Did someone invite you to write something on birds, or was what was your interest to start this research?
well, some of this goes back to my book, Musical Vitality. So there's some of these people show up there. It's just my personal interest in nature, in the natural world, and in, I guess, trying to think about how something like birdsong makes us question claims of uniqueness about human music, right? And aesthetic interest. Lots of things, I guess. Sheer interest in animal others, that too,
Hi, it was a wonderful talk, and I'm particularly interested in the development of a bird song throughout a bird's life, like how they learn.
Yeah.
And how that, you mentioned the spectrogram symbols of the call, how those develop and maybe become more complex throughout a bird's life. Would you say that you could point to some similarity between that type of maybe artistic maturity of a bird and that of maybe a human composer?
Well, I do think there's some kind of parallel to be drawn between, I don't know about a trained composer necessarily, but maybe so. You know, starting with a motif, a melodic idea, working with it, playing around with it, transposing it, doing the pitches backward, you know, or especially the recombination aspect of composing. I'll put this little bit with this little bit and make a melody. Or I know that there's often a little da-da-da thing that I could use, and I like that phrase, but I can connect it with this little da-da-da-da thing or something like that. So I think there are parallels, and it's the pattern formation and recombination, I think, that provides that point of comparison. Yeah.
Just to respond to that quickly, I think it's, I feel like it's more the parallel between improvisation than composition. And I would actually say from my experience as an improviser, learning to improvise, it's exactly the same process, where you take a phrase and you kind of just make variations on it. Maybe I'm anthropomorphizing and projecting, but another point to add to this, I think is also something that I've observed in my own artistic practice of how the capability of your body is shapes how you listen. So I'm a thereminist. I started playing the theremin 5 years ago. I was teaching myself as an experiment in learning. And actually I became interested in birdsong after playing the theremin for a while because I became a better listener. Like I became better at perceiving the structures. And I started impressing all my friends by my ability to imitate different birds. And I feel like there's something about like, it goes back to this vocal learning thing, right? Because you have a body and you're able to hear and then put the sounds into your own body, it changes how you hear it. And I think, I don't know, I think there's a lot of potential for instance, designing tools to expand the human's ability to make the sorts of sounds that birds make, but in a way that's intuitively tied to the body's control. The theremin being one such instrument. The voice, actually, we do have a voice, but I think oftentimes our voices are really stuck in our native languages, which makes it hard to, you know.
And musical systems, too,
All right, I have one more question. You did have your hand up. Do you want to ask it?
Yeah.
Okay.
This might be a pedestrian actually, but I'm wondering about what you said about the enjoyment of self. Your enjoyment of self. I'm wondering, is there a parallel there in terms of like human kind of informal conversation in terms of like, you know, some people mentioned the separative like function of speaking for function versus like enjoyment, but if they're all kind of, is there a part of that that's together in the way we communicate, or can we kind of get some insight in terms of that from this?
That's
my question makes any sense?
That's a good question. I mean, I think there's so many interesting differences between language as spoken versus written, and just like the way, you know, we just use things like intonation to make a statement funny, right? You could say a statement two totally different ways, and we enjoy that shaping, you know. And I think we forget so much about that in our obsession with like syntax. You know, human language has this kind of syntax. It has these kinds of semantics. But if you think about your daily use of language and the shaping, the intonation, the emphasis here, the emphasis there, it's so much more, you know, grounded in the enunciation, right? In the act of the utterance and the sort of, not just the pleasure we take, but the need to communicate. Like, I want to make sure that you know this is funny, right? And how I do that. And I think there just are so many ways our language is not what we think it is in some ways, right?
All right, so the thing that's spectacular about an amazing lecture like this is that exponentially the questions and interests grow and want you to communicate. Fortunately, we do not have that time now, but we have a transition to our papers sessions. A few moments to perhaps go and get a little bit more coffee to reinvigorate ourselves for some more listening. But most importantly, clapping for our